Hi everyone, good afternoon into evening. My name is Dara Udo and I am a current acute care physician. I also have an MPH in global public health, and I am delighted to be moderating today on our inaugural Q&A session. This session is brought to you by the Vaccine Immunotherapy Center in collaboration with COVID Recovery, and basically the series will be known as Advancing Recovery. It's a live Q&A session just designed to increase public access and awareness to pertinent, accurate, and timely information. While I am aware that the current arena is saturated with Q&As and resources on COVID, some factual and others otherwise, we wanted to bring together this series for you guys to give you direct access to top scientists and physicians working in the field of COVID for you to have direct questions with them. This inaugural session is occurring at the tail end of the WHO Vaccine World Immunization Week, which, if you're not aware, is a session that occurs during the last week of April. And basically it is the WHO partners and individuals around the world who come together to focus on vaccines and increase trust and confidence in vaccines, as well as awareness, and remove any barriers to access. Vaccines have been around for over 200 years, and they have been available to help protect us from diseases that would otherwise have caused deadly and devastating outcomes. Unfortunately, around the world, access to vaccines is still a big issue, and mostly in developing countries where the resources just aren't there to get vaccines to people that need them the most. And over the past year, through what we've been experiencing with COVID, we've just seen a snippet of what many other countries suffer through every day. Just emphasizing what the World Health Organization and Vaccine World Immunization Week tends to focus on. So without further delay, I am going to introduce our speakers for today. First and foremost, we have Dr. Mark Poznansky. Dr. Poznansky is the current director and founder of the Vaccine Immunotherapy Center at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is also CEO and founder of COVID Recovery. Dr. Poznansky is an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and he's also an attending physician in infectious diseases for Mass General. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Doris, for that excellent introduction. The thing I would like to stress here is that at the Vaccine Immunotherapy Center, we both are involved in research in terms of the development of vaccines for infectious diseases like COVID-19 and development of new therapies and tests for the disease. But also we're very much committed towards educating people about the importance of vaccines, which definitely appears to be needed every few years. As Dara said, there's 200 years of vaccines having the biggest impact on human health around the globe. And yet it seems like in every generation, we have to relearn that message about vaccination and how important it is. And if this serves as one way to get scientific and humane information about and accurate information about the importance of vaccination in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is going to serve a good purpose here. So thank you very much for involving me in this. I would just say one last thing, which is as I see it now, in the beginning of May 2021, we are absolutely in the midst of a pandemic, and because of the types of things that occur at that point, where countries like India are struck with very significant surges, even now when we're a year out from the beginning of the pandemic in China. So we know we're in the midst when a country the size of India is suffering the way it is in the context of a pandemic that has otherwise pretty much left all countries on the globe injured and continue to be injured by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Absolutely, Mark, and I completely agree with you. And though it does seem that we've come a long way, I do remember this time last year working in acute care where we didn't have the resources and access to medicines and therapeutics that we needed to save lives. My heart only just pours out to everyone in India and that's suffering through this now, but it definitely makes it very real and tangible how quickly things can turn the corner and definitely be in a state of acute and disarray again. So thank you for that. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Jackie Hart. Dr. Jackie Hart is the current director at the Basker Center for Vulnerable Families and Children, also one of the National Network and Family Homelessness Committee. She's also been guest presenter at the Harvard T. Chang School of Public Health on social determinants of health, and she is a professor at Tufts University School of Public Health and a Head Start administrator for children with US Health and Human Services. Hi, Jackie, and welcome.
Hi, Dara. Thank you. So Dara told you a bit about my background. My clinical background has been in lifestyle medicine and prevention, which I now apply to more vulnerable populations where the health disparities are the greatest. A few things. One, you have an array of people here, so we're looking forward to where the direction of where this conversation goes and the types of questions that we can try to field. But I also kind of want to recognize that we're really at a juncture. As Mark said, we are still sort of steeped in the, depth of a real pandemic, as India shows us, and as Dara just described, we've come a long way despite that, it's a great example of how things can shift in one direction or the other pretty quickly. But when I say we're at a juncture, we're sort of changing phases from what I call supply to demand. So most of 2020 and the first part of 2021, we have worked on figuring out how to develop vaccines, how to manufacture them in large quantities, how to manufacture the materials and tools necessary to administer vaccinations. We've set up systems across the country, at least in the US in particular, which is what I can speak most to get vaccines out to people. Now we're entering this phase where the supply is great. The demand is actually starting to dwindle. We've done a very good job of getting vaccines to 40 to 50% of the eligible population. And now we need to actually change our processes to make sure that vulnerable populations like those that I work with and hard to reach populations like rural locations and homebound individuals are getting vaccinated. So I'm sure that many of you have heard the terms vaccine hesitant or vaccine reluctant or vaccine resistant. Some of it is logistics, some of it is the way that we communicate with people, and that's the shift. That's where we're sort of working really hard to get to the hard to reach people and individuals. And the last thing I'll say before we pass it on, when the J&J vaccine was paused, it raised some issues for some of these hard to reach populations. So now that it's been resumed, there are some real positive things about it, and we can talk about the risks and the benefits as this conversation proceeds. But the J&J vaccine has a lot of conveniences that were really, that are important for the process of getting hard to reach people vaccinated. So we may get a chance to talk about that as we move on. It looks like Dara's having some internet issues. So
we'll jump to Katerina. Yes.
Pass that on to Katerina.
Yeah, Katerina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I can introduce myself. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be on this panel with these amazing experts within the field. I am an undergraduate student at UCLA. It's my senior year, so I'm going to be graduating in June of 2021. And I study microbiology, immunology, and molecular genetics. And I was first connected with Vic back in June of 2020 when I was a summer intern with their remote vaccine immunotherapy center unit. And I also started to help launch and write for the COVID recovery website which was aimed in response to the pandemic. At the height of the pandemic, we were looking for an outreach to help those and just see the more humane side of the pandemic and really what was happening to the people. There are a couple things that I hope to touch on with this panel that I hope we can discuss, that I've been seeing myself and that I've been hearing from those who I've spoken to. One of them is just the social effects of vaccination rollout. And I think that there's two sides to that I hope that we can discuss. The first is I'm seeing a lot of people almost with social anxiety. We've been isolated for so long, almost over a year, where it's, don't go into large groups, try and stay home. We're seeing really only our close friends and family. And now that some people are becoming vaccinated, and with the new CDC guidelines saying, okay, you can go outside now and you can eat at restaurants outside and dine in small groups, it's interesting to see some people just not really having a very hard time to integrate back into society. And I can attest to that myself. You're here and you're hearing, okay, you can go have a dinner with your close friends of 5 or 6 people. And, it's safe and, maybe you're vaccinated, so it's safer, but still it's that whole, well, I haven't been outside for so long. So it's really interesting to see the social ripple effect of the vaccine. And it's also just interesting to see how overwhelming it can all be to come try and integrate slowly back into society. So I hope we can touch on that a little bit throughout the panel as well.
Thank you very much indeed. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties, but I do want to talk a little bit about this issue of distribution and the fact that we're being in the midst of a pandemic, and that's both nationally, internationally. Each sort of nation has its sort of job to do, and as you said, Jackie, it's now demand more than supply is the issue, and that we have to recognize that we're at 32% in terms of the percentage of the population that has actually received a full vaccine so far. So we actually have quite a long way to go to get to like something close to 70%, 60-70%, which is considered what is needed for herd immunity. And I do think that this next effort actually involves a redoubling of efforts to get not just the hard to reach and the hard to communicate with, the hard to whatever, we just have to get another 30 or 40% of the population to come out and get vaccinated and understand that it's still absolutely critical that that happens. We're being only a third of the way there. It's actually potentially a problem, which is that when you create a system when not enough people are vaccinated, the virus itself has wiggle room, as it were, to continue to adapt against your vaccine and get around it. So, you've built sort of a half-built wall between you and the virus. Actually, the virus works out how to develop legs to climb over that low wall, and that's why you have to keep building the wall of your vaccine sort of based herd immunity. And I think that there's a sense, well, isn't 32% pretty good? That's, it is good, but it's not enough. And I think we have to have ways across the board here to be able to address that. And I don't know, Jackie, what you're seeing in terms of the sort of the range of efforts, not just individual communications and group communications, but a generalized message that the vaccine momentum has to be kept up here.
So sort of along those lines, Mark, when I was sort of saying that there's a shift in, from this perspective of getting enough supply out there, and now we have to, sort of respond to demand, that the people that are demanding are also shifting. So,
yeah.
So when I said 40 to 50, that's actually people who have had at least one dose. So presumably people in that category are going to go back for their second dose. So there's hope that we'll get to 50% relatively easily. But my question for you, I guess, is I'm seeing a shift in ages. There was sort of this narrative, and Katerina, you should definitely speak to this as well, sort of what you're seeing with peers in terms of their willingness. But there was great messaging early on. The sort of narrative was that people over 65 would get very sick or, hospitalized or even die. So there's high percentages of people in that age range who very willingly lined up to get the vaccine as soon as it was available. Now it's the 18 to 39-year-old group. That's a particular challenge to get vaccinated, even though it's opened up, at least in the US, where it's available to all ages, 18 and up. So one thing that might help people in general, Mark, is if you sort of painted a little picture of what is actually happening in the hospital, since you're in that setting and I'm not. But in the outside, there is that. The people over 65, perfectly willing, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, very eager. It's the 18 to 39-year-old group. So maybe you can speak to what's happening in the hospital. And Katerina, if you could speak to what you're seeing with some of your peers, that would be great.
Yeah, Katerina, let's go to you first, because I'm just as much interested in learning new things, and we're getting questions coming in now from the audience here. But Katerina, it is very useful for both Jackie and I to hear, and I'm sure a lot of people online now, what do you see as the sort of ethos or thinking amongst your age group, which are a critical group now to get vaccinated?
So I think it's interesting because the majority of what I'm hearing for people who are just saying, I don't think I'm going to get vaccinated, I don't need it, it's because that they've had COVID before. And so there's this myth that if you've had COVID before, I mean, of course you have antibodies, right? But we don't know how long those last in regards to the doses of the vaccine. And so they're saying, well, if I've had COVID before, why would I get the vaccine? So I think that's what I've been hearing from the majority of people who have just said, it's not worth it for me. I've already had COVID. I've lived through it. I was fine. Because as we know, it was that 18 to 30-year-old range where there was not a high risk of serious illness and death when the pandemic came out. And so people weren't as worried about getting it between that age group. And so they did get it a lot more between that age group. And now they're saying, well, it was just like a flu for me sometimes. So, I already got it and I have these antibodies. But I think that the problem is that there's this, when it comes to the COVID-19, there's this unknown where we don't really know the effects of COVID-19. We don't know the effects of how long, you'll have immunity. And so I think it's important to bridge that gap between between the unknown and just get the information out to the public.
Yeah, Katerina, that's very helpful. And, even in the hospital, I'm seeing, a younger demographic, because even though the young get less severe disease, the more people that are infected in that age group, the more proportionately you will see in the hospitals. And the hospitalization of younger people with COVID has increased over the last month or so. I do want to make sure that we go to questions here, because we actually have got some very good questions coming in here. Yeah. And I think I'll take the first one, and then there's a very good question here about, at this point, should the focus be on vaccinating the reluctant or in the US or vaccinating in other countries? I'll hand that to Katerina and Jackie. But on the one which we just are picking up here, which is, are the vaccines effective against the variants? And it's good to see Idaris back on again. Is that, yes, we're learning pretty much every day and every week and every month that certainly a good majority of the variants that are emerging are covered by the current generation of vaccines, but some of the variants have escaped from the vaccines, or a vaccine would not particularly protect you against them. So the vaccine makers are already designing the potential boosters that would be needed to cover those new variants. So there's both there's sort of yes and no answer. Yes, certain variants are definitely being covered by the current vaccines, but no, we are actually going to have to develop new vaccines and potentially new vaccine platforms that cover a wider range of the COVID virus that we're up against. So Jackie and Katerina, if you want to talk to this issue about who to prioritize, is it a national thing or is it an international thing?
well, two things. One, just to sort of add to what you just said, Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it is sort of, that's when everybody sort of talks about the race between the vaccine and the variants. The more people that are vaccinated, the less likely we are to make additional variants. So that's why it's this sort of, race to get as many people as possible fully vaccinated. I love this question. I'm not sure exactly. It's a very philosophical question of, and one thing that's interesting is that in some other countries like Canada, they actually, because they don't have an adequate supply at the moment, they are making an effort to make sure that everybody gets their first dose before they move on to the second dose. So one thing that is, one thing that is interesting, and Dara, I would love for you to speak about this as well, is that it's very possible that it's more important to get a single vaccine and become 60 to 70% protected against you, and that's just a number I'm making up just for the record, but to get not 95 to 100% protected, but protected enough against developing severe disease, hospitals being hospitalized or transmitting the virus. So it's, again, it's sort of a philosophical question, but from that perspective, I would almost lean towards, a single dose model or idea. And the reason that I'd love for Dara to speak to this is because she recently wrote a piece that actually talks about this. If when people say the J&J vaccine is only about 70% effective because it's a single dose, we may have found that with Moderna and Pfizer if they were only given as single doses, right? And maybe if J&J were a double dose, we would be getting to the effectiveness rates that those vaccines have seen. So
yeah, no, Jackie, I completely agree. And I think it is a very interesting question. What I did write did speak to levels of seroprevalence in certain communities that may have some baseline exposure to COVID without necessarily manifesting symptoms. So that in those individuals would then a single dose boost their already existing immune system response to COVID to a level that would be more fully protected than not having a vaccine at all, especially when we have such limited supplies. Would a mechanism by which we would start testing people to see if there's any type of exposure or any level of immunity, and then move forward from there to see if they needed, they would be okay with getting one dose versus pushing them to get the 2 doses and maybe saving the 2 doses for the more vulnerable people that haven't been exposed at all, are at greater risk, and whatever else. An interesting question that we did have from someone in Pennsylvania, Mark, and I'm going to put this to you. There are people that have had 1 dose of the 2-dose series and not gotten back to get their second dose. Given that a lot of the information is saying that after 3 months or so, your immune system wanes and you lose your immunity, I know that you work with several different arms of the immune system that people don't necessarily test regularly. What is your take on people just getting 1 dose versus going to get their full 2-dose with the Moderna and Pfizer versus just a 1 dose with J&J and even AstraZeneca out in Europe and elsewhere?
Well, at the beginning of a pandemic and the beginning of rollout, and we are really if you think about it, we're talking about it, rollout of vaccines as if it's been going on for like years. It's been going on for like 3-4 months or whatever. And the point is, we're learning that it is absolutely essential, based on the studies that were done for the regulatory authorities here under the FDA, that the 2 doses are given when that is what maximizes immunity, has been shown to maximize immunity to the virus. So you do need to go back for your second dose. There's no question about that. And then if you have the J&J vaccine that is a single dose, we know that with that single dose you can get to a certain level of protection, and that's what you've got to go for. And I do stand by the view that you get the vaccine that's available to you where you are. There's no time for like shopping around for like the vaccine of choice here. There are 3 circulating vaccines, and you're scheduled for one of them that requires 2 doses. You get the 2 doses. Scheduled for just the single dose of the J&J, you get the J&J. And I would emphasize on the J&J vaccine that's been mentioned before, and I think it's been well publicized in the news. All of the data was reviewed about the safety of it, and the pause was put on, and they scrutinized every single case. That's less than 1 case of this rare blood clot disorder in well over 1 million vaccines delivered, which is considered a very rare occurrence in the use of vaccines. And therefore the pause was released, and people should be receiving the J&J vaccine right now because of the release of the pause. And I think that's absolutely justifiable given the data that was scrutinized to release the pause on that.
Okay.
I did want to, sorry to just punt to Katerina, because I do want to get her thoughts on this national versus international thought about, you maybe it's sort of cliche to say you come from a much more international generation who think more globally, whether it's to do with the climate or the world politics or the situation in individual nations more broadly around the world. What's the take there between the emphasis on national versus international vaccination from your point of view?
I think it's an interesting question, just because I think that it's a very hard question to answer right or wrong, more or less. But I would say that from my own perspective and also from others, it seems as though this risk of variance is what's causing people so much. It's causing a lot of reluctance, and a lot of people, everyone's worried about their variants. And we're seeing that the variants are coming from a lot of other countries. And so I guess my first initial thought was to say, I think there should be focus on other countries with very high positivity rates, because as we saw in China and as we saw in Europe, people like flying back and forth between Europe and the US, it can cause another outbreak, and it can cause variants to come over. And we don't know. I don't think that we don't know the real effects of the vaccine in regards to specific variants that haven't arisen yet. And so I would say that I think it's really important that other countries with high positivity rates should be vaccinated and focused on. But I think that there is this problem with vaccine rollout in regards to refrigerating vaccines in countries that don't have the infrastructure to do so. And on that point, I was actually wondering, we all know that the J&J vaccine was paused, and it is a 1-dose vaccine, which makes it a lot easier to roll out in certain countries with less infrastructure with healthcare. I was wondering everybody's thoughts on how that J&J vaccine might have affected rollout in the US in regards to lower in communities that it's harder to reach, and other countries as well.
I think that's a great question, and especially for Jackie, which, the majority of your work is in underserved communities. How have you seen the rollout within these communities, and do you think that we are effectively reaching them, and are there things that we could be doing better?
Well, actually, I mean, we were relieved when J&J was put back in operation, because for many of the populations that we serve, getting back to people to give a second dose is very, very difficult. They're sort of lost to follow-up. Also, the not needing the refrigeration and that type of infrastructure is convenient for the types of populations where you need to go in. So like to homeless encampments, or for people who are homebound for any number of reasons, including medical reasons, rural locations. So there are many parts of this country where it's way easier to give the single dose and not have the refrigeration required. What I found really interesting when the pause came, the fear kind of across the board was that people were going to lose confidence, right? There were people who were distrusting, were going to say, hey, see, there's this terrible side effect. It actually had the opposite effect. And there were a number of well-run, well-designed polls, that surveyed people kind of across the board, most people felt more confident. Most people were relieved that our systems are actually working, that even though, as Mark said, this, impacts a very, very small number of people, and the term that people love to use is that you're twice as likely to get struck by lightning than to develop this blood clot from J&J. The issue is sort of twofold. One is it's a very different type of blood clot than we're used to seeing, and we treat it differently. So it is good that they sort of paused and said, let's look at this, see if there are any particular risk factors we can use to predict who may or may not get it. But in terms of the data I was just mentioning, it was close to 60% of people who felt relieved that the systems are working, so that if there's something worrisome, we'll take a break, we'll evaluate the data and make an informed decision about what steps to move forward.
We have had a number of questions come in offline and earlier about the J&J vaccine. Everyone obviously understandably is very concerned. Mark, I just wanted to ask you, I guess in summary, if you could explain it as most straightforward as possible, what is the basic mechanism involved in this clotting issue that we're seeing? And what are the things that some people can do? Some of the concerns have been mostly females of reproductive age. Do I need to stop my birth control? Can I take aspirin before or after I get the shot? What are some things people should or shouldn't do in order to prevent this, if there is something that can be done?
Well, I think with vaccines being rolled out to millions of people, the key thing is monitoring the side effects. And obviously, in the case of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, people started to learn. People got painful arms. They didn't feel up to scratch in terms of energy and stuff like that. But the rare but serious side effect was an anaphylactic reaction, or a very, very severe allergic reaction. So what we did was we had people vaccinated, and then we monitored them for 15 minutes thereafter to see if they would develop a very severe allergic response while we had them under our eyes, and that continues to be the case. Now, in the case of J&J, what we've seen from that data, as you say, is women of a specific age, and then the symptoms are headache and the development of clot, specifically in the sort of central area of the brain, and that can generate a very severe headache. And it was occurring in a group 1 week to 3 weeks after they'd received the vaccine. So, in other words, what we've learned is that if you're in that potential risk group for a very rare side effect of the vaccine, you should report to your primary care physician if you're developing a headache, a week to, and this is a week after you had the vaccine, not immediately after it. And if that, becomes a severe headache, I think that's what we have to do. We have to inform the public in that risk group of what they should do in those contexts. With regards to the other uses of, contraception or aspirin or so forth, I would always advise discussing those things with the people who are developing the vaccines, delivering the vaccines at that time. Get information from your local healthcare provider on those points. I think there are these individual cases where to give blanket sort of advice beyond what I said about side effects is really hard to do, and could actually be misleading for the individual, given that we're talking about very, very rare events and what happens to that individual under those very rare conditions. What we have seen so far in the studies, and we need more data, is that vaccines are safe in pregnant women. They're safe with regards to the newborn, that it doesn't impact the health of the newborn. And these were recently published studies. Again, we generated data over the last 4 months, so it's got to be new and needing more and more data. But so far, the indications are that it's safe.
And just To transition to you, Katerina, we've been getting a lot of questions about people getting ready to go back to work, go into the office, and go back to school. And definitely certain school systems have been mandating that some students get their vaccine before they come back onto campus. There's been a lot of controversy, obviously, behind that, and people are back and forth as far as, the ethical responsibility that you have for yourself and others. What is your opinion as far as mandating COVID vaccination for college age students? And what things have you seen put in place in order to facilitate that?
I think it's important to remember that it's a state-by-state basis, the law regarding who can mandate vaccines. So, for example, the California law mandates that all public schools and private schools must have, anyone who's going to a public or private school must have certain immunizations that are recommended by doctors. And this mandate has been in place for years. We see it with the polio vaccine, chickenpox, MMR vaccine, the Hep B. So it's important to remember that this is not just the COVID vaccine. This has been happening for years. And the second thing is that this requirement for vaccines, it's not to, it's in place to keep the community safe. And I think that that's the most important thing to remember, because, it depends on the school you're in, but of course I currently go to a public school, and it's an urban public school. We have 44,000 students at the school. And it's important to remember that we are part of a community. So making sure that you have a vaccine in place and a vaccine requirement, it's just to keep the community safe. Everyone wants to get back to school. Everyone wants to get back to in-person classes. Everyone wants to get back to seeing their friends and their professors, but this can't happen until we put these requirements in place. And I think it's really important to remember also that especially in urban settings, you are a part of your school. But at the same time, we are living in apartments and communities for people's neighborhoods, and you have to keep the people's neighborhoods that you're living in safe as well. So I think that the vaccine requirement is it's to better the community.
Absolutely. And with, my public health lens and everybody else's as well, it is an individual infection, but it's also a public health issue. And the more things you can do to protect others, especially those that can't get vaccinated, is really going to be the way we move forward with this. In the same vein as that, I've gotten a lot of questions and a lot of intrigue into home rapid COVID testing. I guess this is an interesting question for you, Mark, as well as you, Jackie, where some places are advocating for people to have access to these home testing kits and to have them be able to test themselves on a regular basis and or before going to certain classes, going to visit a relative in a nursing home and otherwise. How realistic and applicable do you think having something like that in place is? I'm going to ask this first to you, Jackie. I know, Mark, you're familiar with the technology behind them and the availability, but in certain communities, access-wise and applicability, like how realistic do you think it is to do something like that moving forward?
I think it is realistic. I think it would be extremely helpful, actually. The more accessible information is, and the more the more we can learn and the more we can gather. So I think for the populations that I work with, it would be really welcome. I haven't seen it happening in a kind of broad, widespread way. But, when transportation is an issue, at least where I am, it requires your own transportation to get to a lot of the testing centers. I mean, there is public transportation available for some, but early on in the pandemic, it was hard to get appointments and it was hard to physically get there. So anything that makes it easier and more convenient is definitely welcome from my perspective. The other thing I just wanted to add to what you and Katerina were mentioning earlier, there's this sort of phrase about community immunity. So rather than like mass vaccination, which has sort of a terrible ring and poor connotations, the idea of sort of of encouraging people to get vaccines, if not for themselves, then for others, right? So that idea of community immunity, and it's been very effective in a lot of populations, puts more of a positive spin. Like, you're not just doing this for yourself, you're doing this for everyone.
Yeah, I just want to talk about testing because, I've always been an advocate for testing because exactly under this principle, the more information you have, the better. And if the tests are regulated carefully as they are, people understand the sort of context that sometimes they can actually be wrong. The test has a small chance that it can be wrong, but nevertheless, they're accurate enough to be helpful in making decision-making around doing things, and who goes to work and the rest of it, then they should be encouraged. And in fact, I was just talking to my sister in the UK, and they're handed out by the government lots of rapid testing kits that they use when they're making a decision about going out and so forth. I think information is the thing that will make a difference here. Information about vaccines, information about why things are put on pause, information why things are taken off pause, information about whether you're positive from a swab or not. All of these things guard against what is the other terrifying sort of motivating force, which is fear. And I was asked a question by some very educated people about what the state of the pandemic is now. Should we be frightened? And I said, no, you shouldn't be frightened. You should be intelligent and informed. Because if you're informed by, intelligence and data and so forth, you know what you need to do. Fear is that great thing that causes you to potentially run in 3 different wrong directions at the same time, whereas information and intelligence will guide you precisely what you need to do with the best information present at that time to make a decision about what you're going to do next. And we're actually used to that type of thing all the time in our lives, of processing data. When we drive a car, a light pings on that says our oil is low. We immediately go, well, I'm jolly glad I know that, because I'll go and get my oil changed. We don't drive around fearful that our oil is going to run out in our car and we're just going to be left with a seized up engine. We're used to handling information, and this is a type of information, maybe it feels as if we're inundated about it, but it is useful information with regards to making decisions about your day-to-day life. And testing is an example of that. Rapid testing at home is an example of that. Right.
Absolutely agree. And accurate testing as well. I've had a lot of questions come in about rapid testing versus PCR test, which is what we consider the gold standard. How accurate are the rapid tests, and is it wise to change your day-to-day or your life and your goings about based on a rapid test, given that there is some question about false positives and false negatives with them?
So there are false positives and false negatives of every single test out there, including PCR. But however, the rate of those is much, much lower with PCR than the rapid tests, which are looking for protein rather than the actual sequence of the virus itself. And so consequently, it's still better based on those rates to have that information than to not have that information, because it does allow you to reduce the risk. It doesn't allow you to reduce the risk to 0. You might have a negative PCR, but still, as you go out, be shedding live virus. So there's still that little risk there. But having a negative test is still better than having no test at all, when you're actually in a situation where there is risk of either you spreading the virus to someone else or someone spreading the virus to you. I guess at the bottom of all of this is vaccination is still, and that's, I think, what I see from the CDC. Emphasis is still on vaccines, which does make sense. And then beyond that, testing.
Right. I've just had a slew of questions come in, so I'm going to try to kind of dig through and get some of the pertinent ones to you. A recurrent question would be reinfection. If someone has had COVID already, what is the risk of reinfection? And also, if they've been vaccinated already, how long does immunity last from infection versus vaccination?
I'll take that and just say that again, because we're new in the pandemic, new in the rollout, there's data coming in from the original phase, the very beginning phase 3 trials of some of these vaccines. The rate of reinfection is less than 0.3%. That's less than 1 in 300, 1 in 400, maybe down to 1 in 700. And then when those people were detected as getting COVID after vaccination, it was mild disease. So they didn't get severe disease, they didn't get moderate disease, they got mild disease. There is data coming in from India where doctors who were vaccinated have been reinfected. I haven't seen the analysis with regards to whether they are getting mild, moderate, or severe disease, but that data, Idarisa, is being really rigorously gathered at the moment, because we're that close to the beginning of the vaccine campaigns that we are only just learning how long does the protection last, how much of a risk are you for reinfection. I think the thing that we're likely to find out is yet again that the vaccine prevents the most severe and even the moderate levels of disease over at least, we think now, 6 to 9 months, coming on to a year, again based on the original phase 3 trials, and then the gathering data as the current rollout of the EUA, the emergency use authorization of the vaccines has occurred.
All right, so another question we have here, and I'm going to send this over to you, Jackie. Has the adoption of vaccines been hindered for political reasons?
Yes and no. I mean, truthfully, as the data is being collected, that gap is narrowing. So the media has kind of played up this idea that depending on your political party, it sort of decides whether you are willing to get a vaccine or not. That gap, thankfully, is narrowing. There are a lot of people in rural locations that are reluctant or hesitant for a variety of reasons, as there are for people of color in urban areas, as there are for people who sort of believe in natural health and holistic medicine, which that's kind of the world that I come from. Their hesitancies resemble each other in some ways, and the approach to trying to help people beyond those, beyond the things that they're worried about, is similar for every group. So actually in rural locations, West Virginia being a really excellent example, they've been doing a very good job. So this idea that your political persuasion determines your willingness, it's becoming less and less the case. The thing that is consistent is that people need to hear from trusted individuals and trusted sources. So the best way to convince people that it's the right thing to do or a good thing to do for themselves and for others is to talk with their PCP. So family physicians, their internists, those are the people that are most convincing, which I'm not a proponent for one vaccine over another, but that is also another reason why having J&J back on board is a plus, because if a physician in a rural location, say, convinces a patient who's in front of them, ideally they can then give them the vaccine right then and there, rather than having to help them schedule for elsewhere. It's much easier for doctors to have the single dose and one that doesn't require such low temperatures. But anyway, that's lessening, and we have to just be patient and use trusted sources to communicate the science, the information, as Mark keeps impressing on all of us, and hear people out. Don't step on them. Listen to what they have to say, and respond to them with data, with science, with information.
Right. So I guess this one would be for you, Katerina. There have been a lot of people on socials kind of gathering and traveling and living their lives like we're completely out of this pandemic. And as Mark spoke to earlier before we got into Q&A, we're still very much in a pandemic, and we do need to maintain diligence moving forward. Are there things that you've seen in your friends groups or outside in the community that people are doing that are concerning behaviors? And do you think there are other things and other mechanisms that should be put in place in order to continue to keep everyone safe?
I think that I can really only speak to my own experiences with regards to social behaviors. I think that for the most part, moving back onto campus I've been here for since September, and I was actually very amazed by the student body following the CDC guidelines put out, and UCLA really making the guidelines, saying how important it was, really stressing the responsibilities that students have in regards to their community. And so I was actually really amazed by UCLA and the student body for following the CDC guidelines, the safety guidelines put out. That being said, I think that when the vaccine rollouts did start to pick up, and a lot of people that I know in UCLA have been vaccinated at this point, I'm seeing a change in behavior where, in regards to larger social gatherings, there are more and more of those. And I think it's tough because as students, especially being 21, 22, 19, it's really hard. I think that the best word for it is exhaustion. Everybody's exhausted. And that doesn't go without saying that everybody's exhausted, not just students, not just people who are 18, 19, 20, but it's tough when even your senior year is put on hold due to the pandemic. And I think that the best thing that we can possibly do is just remind people and just say, can you just hold on a little bit longer, because we're not out of it and we're not over. And I think it's also important for the media and for the CDC and for any other, information through science to say, like, hey, we are not out of this thick. With the new CDC guidelines, everyone's like, oh, we can go out, we can go out unmasked, but that's not necessarily the case. You have to remember that, not everybody is vaccinated, and you just have to keep holding on a little bit longer.
Right. Absolutely agree. And Mark, I know that there's a lot that's coming through the Vaccine Immunotherapy Center, and you're working on a lot of next generation applications for vaccinations and getting them out quicker and better and more efficiently, being able to protect us in the community. We have a couple last questions I'm just going to ask about the variants and concern about how long it's going to take for us to get a vaccine together for the variants. Will it take as long as it did for us to get the original vaccines out?
So the original vaccine was out in 326 days from the original identification of what the target was. That will be telescoped a little bit, but the safety issue will still be needed to be worked out. So in other words, although we know you need 2 doses of, let's say, Pfizer, what if you get a booster 9 months later? Is that safe? And like with all new approaches, there will have to be studies to prove that. The other thing is that they can't be made fast enough for the variants that are emerging, as we can see from the pandemic as it rolls around the planet. And so what we're really looking to is what we spoke to earlier, which is platforms that can generate vaccines much faster and much more broadly, that could take on a whole host of different variants at the same time. And that's where the emphasis currently is in the next generation. We think of the first generation, the warp speed vaccines, as sort of the key thing to hold back the biggest wave of the pandemic, and certainly where it could be rolled out in countries like the US, that has certainly affected things significantly. But that's the first stopgap. The next thing is vaccines which really hold back the pandemic and the emergence of variants. And I would remind everybody that this issue that actually Jackie emphasizes, that the more we increase the vaccination rate, that's even with the current set of vaccines, is a tremendous way of holding back the development of variants. So whatever we can do nationally, whatever we can do to help internationally, is a very good thing in combating the variants essentially as well.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We don't have enough time to answer any more questions, but this is going to be a recurring series of live Q&A questions. So please do look out for emails and links for the next session. And please do submit your questions ahead of time so we can kind of get to all of them. I'd just like to close with remarks from everybody. We'll start with you, Katerina, if you'd like to leave us with any closing remarks for today.
I'd just like to say it was a pleasure to be on the panel with all these amazing doctors and experts. And I think it's just the bottom line of this panel is to say that vaccines are efficient. And if you can, and if you're able to go out and get a vaccine, please do so.
Great. Okay. Jackie, any closing remarks?
Just thank you. And yeah, keep your eye out for additional conversations with other people from other perspectives. And as Katerina said earlier, patience, I know it's hard. And I was just thinking, Katerina, I so admire how patient you've been through all of this. And maybe in one of these other conversations, you'll share your secrets about how you've maintained that. And yeah, I also agree with Katerina, get vaccinated if you can, and encourage others to do it. Just be kind and patient in the way that you communicate and hear them out, hear what their worries and concerns are. That's the best way to convince them.
Okay. And Mark, any closing remarks?
Well, firstly, again, thank you, fellow panelists and Dr. Dara Sadudo for moderating this, because there's so much information that's needed, and the way that it's given is very important. We hope to be giving as accurate information as we possibly can to inform this decision to go out and get vaccinated, because that's really the emphasis. There are 3 safe and effective vaccines out there, and like Jackie was alluding to, we have to maintain the demand high to meet the challenge that the COVID-19 pandemic poses. I'd also like to thank those people listening who have been on the front line of combating COVID-19. I often think it's the people who are volunteering to give vaccinations, people who are caring for people with COVID-19 at some risk to themselves, and serving all of the other frontline functions that are needed as a community, as a national community, to come up against this very, very significant challenge. I think that those people and their families and friends and their networks who've made that possible, including the vaccine rollout, have to be given a great vote of thanks.
Right. Well, thank you all for really your insights and your time on a Sunday, a beautiful Sunday at that. And I just want to echo everything that's been said here and to really emphasize that this is a community effort to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and taking care of everybody, especially those that cannot take care of themselves. And thank you all for all the work that you're doing, and everyone out there listening in being diligent and continuing to help get us all safely out of this. Thanks again, and right, have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.